Hi, Dr. P here to discuss a topic that might not turn out the way you might think. I'm going to compare role-playing games with adventure novels. Ask someone to compare an RPG to a novel, and the first thought is likely they're both extended stories. But that's not what I have in mind, nor is it a good comparison. Novels are controlled, they're directed, they are authored by one or two people. RPGs are, by nature, free form. A player can try to do anything, and there are many participants. And I should say, these are tabletop RPGs. Computer RPGs, it's not even worth a comparison. Novels emphasize character, plot, conflict, setting, climax and denouement, and point of view. These are the elements of a good novel. The RPG referee or GM can't control all of these and controls some quite weakly. So the typical RPG adventure, even if the players are led around by the nose, is not much of a novel. Similarly, when a video game is turned into a film, the film has a new plot and story because the games are usually weak novels. I'm particularly put in mind of Prince of Persia, where the person who was primarily responsible for the game worked for years to get the movie done. But even he said the game is like a B movie plot. If you want to make a really good movie, you've got to do a different plot, a different story. Now keep in mind here, we're comparing adventure novels with tabletop role-playing games. And I mean games, as in something with opposition, with a possibility of failure or loss. I'm leaving out what people call RPGs, where people collectively tell one another a story, or they collectively create a world, or they do something else that's a joint play activity, but it's not a game. People don't always like it when I say that, but we have to narrow the definition down or we can't discuss it because we'd be talking about two completely different things and giving them the same name. So we're going to compare many of these elements of a novel with how it works in RPGs. Character first. Novelists have to present characters that the reader cares about because otherwise, if the reader doesn't care about the characters, how can the story affect the reader emotionally? Now there are novels where you read in order to find out what happens next, but even then, you probably should have some attachment to the characters. Now, in RPGs, each individual player usually cares a lot about his or her characters. And we can hope they care about other players' characters as well, but many times I've seen the opposite, where the player only cares about himself and doesn't care about the others. The importance of characters is emphasized in both of these things. Novels tend to protect the important characters, although there are exceptions like George Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series, which is normally known as Game of Thrones, where characters drop like flies, including the major characters. In an RPG, the GM usually protects the characters. Remember, the GM's purpose is to threaten the characters, both what they have and their lives, so that the players will be worried, so that there'll be tension. The purpose is not to wipe everybody out or even to kill many of the characters. We'll contrast this with other games, many of which don't even have characters, but where the purpose of one player is to, in essence, wipe out the other player in many cases. Now what about the lucky part? Most adventure novels, especially ones written more recently, are testaments to good luck. The protagonists are immensely lucky or they would not succeed. That's part of what makes it a novel. It's something out of the ordinary. A novel is not mundane, it's unusual, or it should be. It's the same in RPGs, owing to subtle actions of the GM. But an obvious one is, if you have a party of third level characters, you put them up against a challenge that's appropriate for third level characters. And that's not one that they are going to lose to 50% of the time. It's one where if they play reasonably well, they will beat the challenge. That's the lucky part in RPGs. Now, the actual dice rolls of the players may not be out of the ordinary, but things will still tend to fall their way. Otherwise, they die in many instances, and that won't work for tabletop games. It works for computer role-playing games, and one reason why computer role-playing games just don't work as a comparison to novels is you can't lose, you can't fail, you respawn. It's almost a why bother. You can't have people dying in tabletop games because you don't have a respawn. And again, in novels, the same sort of thing happens. I recently read a series, young adult series, The Pillars of Reality, and the heroine and the hero are wonderful people, and they do great things, but there are times when it's just impossible to believe that they're as lucky as they are, especially toward the end. But in a novel, it can happen because it's a novel, it's not real. Plot. Often when people say story, they only or primarily mean plot. It's a sequence of events. A professionally written story is a lot more than a plot, of course, but the plot is important to the story. RPGs have plots. Some of those are devised by the GM, others happen through interaction of the players with the situation set up by the GM. Even if the GM can impose his or her plot on the game, players tend to deviate from it. Nor is the GM likely to be as good at plot as a professional novelist, let's face it. If they were that good, they might be a professional novelist themselves. It's again, like I was saying about Prince of Persia and other video games, the people doing the plotting are not generally professional novelists, and they're not going to generally be as good at it. Conflict is another element of novels traditionally, although sometimes nowadays novels don't seem to have a protagonist and antagonist. They just have people who do things and then it ends. But not usually adventure novels. And that's why I've narrowed this down to adventure novels. A lot of games even have largely removed conflict, Euro-style games. But are they good games? Well, I'd say no, but many will disagree. RPGs are especially good at personifying conflict, having an arch-villain who's clearly the antagonist. Setting is an obvious element of both novels and RPGs. It's much more important in some than in others, and it's a place where RPGs and novels are often similar. Perhaps of all these elements, this is the one where they're closest together. Point of view. There's a lot of difference between a story with multiple points of view and one with only one point of view. And you can ask yourself as you read, is it first person or third person or rarely something else? Jim Butcher, author of the Dresden Files, writes the Dresden Files in first person. He has a 6-novel series that's written in third person. He has another series he's just started written in third person. They don't seem to be as good. They're not bad, but they're not as good as the Dresden Files. Is that because of the point of view, or is it because of other things? I don't know. RPGs are naturally about multiple points of view, and those points of view are first person, usually. Each player experiences it as though they were there. Now, some players prefer to use third person. Instead of saying, I do such and such, they say, my character does such and such. That's a matter of choice. Some people put themselves into the game. Some people treat the game as something where they're an actor following a script that they've sort of made in their own mind. Climax and denouement. Climax is something to conclude the main conflict, which you usually get in a role-playing game campaign, and you often get in individual adventures. The denouement is the final part of a play, I'm quoting Wikipedia, I think, the final part of a play, movie, or narrative in which the strands of the plot are drawn together and matters are explained or resolved. And you usually get that in RPGs as well as in novels. But they can't be as well controlled by the GM in a game as they can be controlled by an author in a novel. Sometimes we have games with multiple stories. It's not unusual in video games, and it's important because the video game is done when somebody has figured out the story. So you get people talking about, I beat the game, because they've gone through it, they know the story, they can solve the puzzle, they're done. Games with multiple stories are much more common in tabletop. Sometimes that's explicit, as in the 50 scenarios to play in Betrayal at House on the Hill. Someone on Board Game Designers Forum said, story machines are games that create unique stories through gameplay. Well, that's what I'm looking for in design. Players write their own stories using the hooks and constraints I've provided. They're not the quality of professional stories, but they are very interesting to the participants because they are the participants. And that's what you get in a game that you don't get in a novel. The players in a game can be participants in what's going on. In a novel, you're not a participant generally, although there are attempts to change that. You are an observer. The vagaries of chance come into this. In the late 70s, I took part in a D&D adventure, which was being run for a person who wanted to turn a D&D adventure into a written story. So we tried to help make it more exciting, but we ran into the vagaries of chance. Now, novelist completely controls chance. Somebody can stand up on the wall and be shot at, and shot at, and shot at, and somehow they're missed. But in a game, if you're rolling dice, that person's probably going to get hit. In this particular game, I had a 4th level fighter who tried to do something heroic that he normally wouldn't do, and an ogre killed him. Well, that doesn't make for much of a story. So to conclude all this, there's a lot of difference between novels and tabletop RPGs. In order to make the RPG much like a novel, you remove it from the realm of game, which is something that you can fail at or lose, and put it into another realm, a realm of story but not game. Thanks for listening.